We've heard the news from the BBC.
You can post on facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay or get in touch via Twitter at BBC_WHYS.
My name is Boris Maximov. So the saga of the outcome of Russian presidential elections rumbles on. A strong and seemingly self-confident leader, Vladimir Putin, celebrates in his castle, otherwise known as Kremlin, and looks forward to another 6 or maybe even 12 years in power. But the images that appear on TV screens are strange. The city center is flooded with police and army vehicles. Protesters gather in squares and get arrested. These protesters are a mixed bunch, from liberals to Democrats to proto-fascists and communists. And everyone in Russia asks himself the same question: what next? People debate scenarios. Will events turn out like in Egypt, or in Libya, or China? Or will the country turn into a Belarus, the last dictatorship in Europe? Or the possibilities are endless. But people, both in power and in opposition, look abroad, not for help, but for inspiration. It's the most read story all around the world, including the Straits Times, Jamaica Observer, Haaretz, etc., etc., etc. Well, Mark, what do you have to say?
Well, I think people involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement in the U.S. are watching the protests and expressing their solidarity with the protesters, because most of them feel that it's all part of the same global anti-corruption, pro-democracy movement. And the photos remind me of similar police actions in New York City, in Oakland, and Seattle. And in Seattle, we've seen confrontations with the police for years, since the demonstrations against the World Trade Organization in 1999. And the police here have been investigated by the U.S. Department of Justice, which concluded that the police department has a policy of using excessive force. And that has included the use of concussion grenades, tear gas, and rubber bullets against protesters in the past. So as we look at it, I think we understand that there's a world economic and political crisis going on right now, and people are wanting freedom, and they're wanting to change the systems that govern them at this point, because they don't feel like their leadership is speaking for them, either the corporations or their governments.
And sorry to interrupt for a second, yes, but we're getting comments on Facebook and an email. Bruce in Wales writes on Facebook, yes, Russia is corrupt, but isn't any country. How many MPs have we sent to prison? The thing about Russia is that they openly admit to problems. Or Alex in the US as well also writes on Facebook, I think the underlying cause of protests has been economic conditions. The global economic slowdown has hurt Russian economy. Protests will continue. The Russian spring has already begun. So, Mark, what do you think?
Well, in the United States, the Occupy Wall Street movement has definitely been committed to nonviolent civil disobedience. But there have been times when there have been confrontations with police, and I think that that's been, a part of the movement for good or bad, and I see that happening in Russia as well. I think that what's happening on the streets there is a similar uprising against people that are in power. There's a lack of trust. There's obviously corruption going on in the system there, and people are calling it out, and they're speaking out with their feet and with their voices out in the streets. There are even protests in Canada right now against voter suppression there. So this is also a worldwide phenomena that has to be addressed.
So it seemed to me...
Could I say something here?
Yes, of course.
Well, I just wanted to support the points made by Mark, but just mention one irony that given Russia's communist past, one would have expected that, putting down protesters or coming down hard on them would happen more in Russia. But from what I see on the television screens of various news channels, the coming down hard is happening more in the U.S. than it's happening in Russia.
Well, in Greece more than the U.S. and in Egypt more than all of them.
Well, I have to say that
in
Seattle there was an occupation of a warehouse by Occupy Wall Street activists, and the police here commandeered a fire truck, ladder truck, and heavily armed with assault rifles, police, SWAT teams went up and kicked those people out of the building who had no criminal histories and had no weapons and no violent intent. So, I think it's been happening around the world where there's often an overreaction to popular unrest. And that is probably not a smart move on the part of the authorities, because, of course, it just adds to the vehemence and the passion of the people that want to go out and protest.
I'd also want to add a warning trend about, attacks on journalists. and citizen media, which are, I think, uniform across the board. We've seen some similar attacks, for instance, in Oakland, where journalists were kettled, and they weren't allowed outside of the kettle despite having press credentials. And, of course, in Greece, where journalists and citizen media are targeted all the time. And yesterday in Russia, several journalists were arrested alongside other protesters. So we're seeing, at least on that level, that the eyes of the world aren't, very sympathetic to authorities. And they want to. This is a worrying trend across the board.
Yes, and Max?
Well, I agree with what. Actually, his line is not very clear. The gentleman who's from Greece, but I do agree with him that when the police have come down hard on the protesters in Greece, but there were a lot of fires set, and I understand the frustration and the problems that the Greeks as a people are facing. Because when you say Greece is corrupt, it's not that every person in Greece is corrupt. Unfortunately, what happens is that the corruption or the playing around with the debt figures or the economic figures is done by a certain small percentage of people, and then when the IMF or whoever brings in these stringent structural adjustments, the ordinary man suffers. So I see that frustration just sitting in my living room watching the TV. And I understand
it's even worse because Greeks are frustrated with their politicians who are part of the corrupt system. I mean, the politicians themselves leading the transition are themselves part of the problem. And police brutality has been...
Yes. So, Max, what is your opinion on what's going on
in Greece?
Well, I happen to see the news on the BBC channel as well as the Russia Today channel. I do see that there are, rallies in favor of Putin and also opposition rallies, but according to the news, just about only 200 people were arrested. And the arrest in today's Russia is not like being put into the Lubyanka prison, as it used to happen in the past. So I see this as a good sign that dissent is there in Russia, it's being expressed, and that's what democracy is all about, because whether Putin had won or Zyuganov had won, there would have been protests either way. So whoever wins, that's the democratic game that people will oppose. And the question is, do you do it in a civil way or you do it in a very violent way?
Until recently, until late 1990s, there were no protests after elections. People were going to vote and just accepted the results. Something is happening in Russia.
Okay. What I would say is perhaps that at that time, the Russians were in shock because I think after the crisis of the 90s, their currency was devaluated, something like 3 zeros or 2 zeros were removed. That would have put everybody in a lot of pain. The first 8 years or 9 years of Putin's presidency, the economy grew 6-7 times. Average incomes grew about 8 times, something like that. People were sort of getting on their feet. Now that people are on their feet, I suppose the divisions of society will start. The middle class will have different objectives. The richer class will have different objectives. The working class will have different objectives. So maybe it's because of that. And also it could be that, people get tired of seeing the same face. Though I feel that Putin has done well for Russia, for the average Russian person.
Well, you're speaking from Singapore, and you know exactly what's going on in your neighborhood of the world. In Taiwan, in South Korea, as soon as incomes reach certain level, there was a mass movement for democracy, and the strongmen disappeared from the political scene. Is that what you're predicting for the present regime in Russia?
No, I think Putin should stay, because when you see what's happening, the economic crisis in America as well as in Europe, right now, everybody in the world, I don't care where they are from, I don't care about their race or their religion, you need stability. Now, yes, if you talk about the Middle East, there is no stability, it's instability, but as long as it's heading in the right direction towards democracy, rights for the people, right for them to earn a decent wage, I think it's in the end for the good. The process may not be so beautiful, may not be so peaceful, but I don't necessarily see Putin being brought down. I don't think so. Russia has still a long, long way to go. It's not a very big economy, even as compared to India.
Okay,
right.
We have...
Can I interject here?
Yes, please go. Asteris, please go.
We're seeing two different sort of trends. On the one hand, we're seeing democracy movements even where they don't even, they're not even tolerated. Like, for instance, how it started in Libya, Syria. And in other countries where they slowly shift the nature of it, like in Egypt, it's ongoing. I mean, they do have still a military junta, but they're having a political dialogue and moving things. But on the other hand, we're seeing a continuous repression slowly shifting towards a more authoritarian nature worldwide. I mean, in Chile, in Greece, in Russia, and all these movements, of course, have differences, but the nature of the repression being, ongoing is homogeneous on some level. So maybe, protest movements should focus on that and try to, protests aren't opposing to stability necessarily. You can have protests in a democratic state and still have stability and progress.
Yes, we just seen a mass protest movement in the United States, for example. And speaking of United States, Mark, a blogger for the Huffington Post who lives in Seattle, we have a few more comments on Facebook and on Twitter. Chandra posts on Facebook, Russia is on a downward spiral. Putin could still change course and give Russians the basic freedoms they're yearning for. He has the magic wand. Paul, an American soldier, asks on Twitter, is there a possibility of return to pre-1990s Russia? Yelena in London tweets, it's surprising how much the West cares. Belarus is a complete dictatorship, yet everyone's quite interested in Russia. Is it because of their money? So, Mark, in Seattle, what do you think? Is it because of their money that we do care and do discuss it here on World Have You Say in London?
Well, as I pointed out before, there have been these kinds of resistance movements in Libya and Egypt and Bahrain and Yemen all over the world. So this is not a new phenomenon that was happening in Russia. But I did want to respond actually to the other gentleman about, I live in a country which often spouts democracy and freedom as our aim around the world. And yet here in my own country, there have been some very questionable elections, and there's been a Supreme Court decision which allows corporations to give unlimited amounts of money to political candidates with no accountability. So many people in our country also feel that, and also there's the collaboration there with corporate media. In the United States, we've been ranked somewhere in the 20s in terms of freedom of press around the world. And it's not necessarily government control of media, it's corporate control of media. So given those two factors, corporate control of our elections,
and lots of people say that. And lots of people say that Vladimir Putin won just because he had an incredible amount of media exposure. Is it the same in the States? Mitt Romney is buying tons of airwaves in every state.
In the United States, a few corporations own all of the media outlets. There's a small grassroots alternative media and community and public radio stations, but they've all lost most of their funding during these austerity measures all over the country. And so the corporate media in the United States, especially networks like Fox, are basically mouthpieces for political parties, even though they portray themselves as, quote, fair and balanced. So I think it's the same problem all around the world, just with different examples.
Successfully sort of hijacked back the narrative. It was amazing the way, across the United States, they managed to change the perspective and the narrative and influence other movements as well as being influenced themselves. And it continues. That was amazing, and the Russians aren't doing that. I know that, it's sort of hypocritical to speak about the global community and only talk about the lingua franca, which is English, but you need people to sort of read in English and communicate. We need the movement to link up and, exchange ideas and methods and see what issues drive them in common. And right now, the U.S. movement and the Russian movement are the most important because they have so much at stake, these countries. So, we remain in a position where we'll be influenced by the movements either way. So they need to sort of do outreach,
I agree.
Boris, could I ask a question from Fidelis?
Of course.
Yeah, because Fidelis made the point that if Russia does not change its election process or continues to have the same election process, then it may have a negative impact on African leaders who, like they say, They try to behave like tribal leaders who want to live until, be in power until they die. But the fact is that almost all the international observers and all the webcams have shown that the election process was quite transparent. Yes, it was. There were violations, but some of them were just technical. Some of them were lack of knowing the process. Yes, there was a case of ballot stuffing in Dagestan,
yes,
which the Election Commission of Russia has said that they will discount those results or look into them. So I think maybe did Fidelis make his point too strongly, because implicitly what he's saying is that this whole election was a farce, which I don't think it was, and I don't think the international observers felt so.
You can tweet us using the hashtag WHYS. So far, pretty much everybody mentioned word corruption in Russia and everywhere else. According to Transparency International, the level of corruption in Russia is exactly the same as Nigeria. Fidelis?
Yes, thank you very much. Those of us here in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, much more...
Excuse me, Fidelis, can you hear us?
Yes, yes, I can hear you now.
Now we can hear you as well.
Okay, all right. Those of us in Nigeria, especially the rest of Africa, are much more frustrated about what is going on in Russia, particularly regarding the last elections. The fear we have here is that the impact of Russia on African leaders might be the first place to hit in the first instance, because if Russia continues the way it runs its elections, definitely they're going to send wrong signals to African leaders who want to perpetuate themselves in office. And that is our concern here.
So you're comparing Russia to Africa in many ways, yes?
Yes, of course. I compare them. I compare Africa and Russia in many ways, especially in election process and the suppression of dissent. They don't like hearing people to make their views. They don't like people expressing their viewpoints at any given time. And moreover, we are trying to develop. We want growth. We want economic growth. We want employment. We want good health system. And with what is going on in Russia, it's going to impact negatively on us.
Well, Nigeria recently had a very successful protest movement against abolition of petrol subsidies, and it worked.
Yes, of course it works. We understand that. But you have to be on the guard. Any type of development, especially from a country that is perceived to be developed, will have a negative impact on us. Though I don't consider Russia a developed country.
Unfortunately, the bewitching hour is upon us, and the program is coming to a rapid conclusion. But judging by your reaction to what may or may not be happening in Russia, most of you agree that Russia is becoming like the rest of the world, grassroots movements pushing the powers to be in unknown direction. And that's it for World Have You Say from London. Thank you from the BBC, and thank you from me, Boris Maximov. Bye-bye.